The story began the way many neighborhood dramas do, with a single letter from the Homeowners Association. At first glance, the envelope looked like any other notice, the sort of dry correspondence most residents dreaded finding stuffed into their mailbox. But this particular piece of mail was about to ignite a chain reaction that no one in the community could have predicted. The HOA, known for its endless rules about fences, shutters, lawns, and even the color of people's garden mulch, had decided to tighten restrictions once again. This time, the target was something that seemed almost trivial: flags. For years, residents had displayed small flags in their yards, national flags, seasonal banners, or novelty ones that simply added a splash of personality to their otherwise uniform houses. It wasn't unusual to see a college football flag flying during fall or a cheerful holiday flag in December. But the HOA board had decided they wanted uniformity, and in their minds, flags of any kind disrupted the pristine appearance of their perfectly planned community. The notice was blunt. Effective immediately, all flags, banners, and lawn decorations resembling flags were prohibited. No exceptions. Anyone caught displaying one would face fines, escalating penalties, and eventually liens on their property if they refused to comply. For most neighbors, the letter was just another frustration. Some sighed, took down their flags, and grumbled quietly about the board over morning coffee. Others ignored it at first, waiting to see if the rule would really be enforced. But for one homeowner, this wasn't just another arbitrary rule. This was personal. The homeowner had always loved flags. Not only the traditional stars and stripes, but all sorts of banners that represented stories, cultures, and imagination. Over the years, their lawn had become a small but proud gallery, a rotating display of national flags from countries they had visited, whimsical flags featuring astronauts, dragons, and even pirates, and commemorative flags that marked special occasions. It was never messy, never overwhelming, just a unique expression of personality in a neighborhood where so much looked identical. But now that individuality was being stamped out with a single vote by a board that seemed determined to strip every ounce of character from the neighborhood. The decision to ban flags felt less about aesthetics and more about control. And that sense of control, arbitrary, heavy-handed, and smug, was the spark that lit the fire. At first there was frustration, then disbelief, then something deeper: defiance. Instead of quietly accepting the order, the homeowner began to think about ways to respond. They imagined what it would feel like to stand their ground against the board, not through shouting or arguments, but through something far more powerful: creativity. The more they thought about it, the clearer it became. If the HOA said no flags, then flags were exactly what the neighborhood was going to see. Not one flag, not a dozen, but hundreds. The HOA had overreached, and this lawn was about to become the canvas for a statement so bold that it could never be ignored. The planning began quietly. It started with research, finding suppliers who could ship bulk orders of flags in every imaginable design. There were pirate flags, space-themed flags, rainbow-colored flags, medieval banners, and historical standards. There were joke flags with cartoon animals, elegant flags with detailed crests, and even a few absurd ones that no one could possibly expect to see fluttering on a suburban lawn. The homeowner made lists, filled online shopping carts, and tracked shipping dates with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Next came logistics. How many poles would be needed? What spacing would create the most dramatic effect? The lawn wasn't especially large, but with careful arrangement, it could hold rows and rows of flags, each one standing tall like a soldier in formation. The homeowner sketched out diagrams on paper, marking grids, and plotting how the flags could be arranged not just for density, but for spectacle. They thought about the statement they wanted to make. This wasn't just a prank or an act of petty revenge. This was about principle. It was about pushing back against an HOA culture that seemed to value conformity over community, appearance over expression, and petty power over real neighborly spirit. By filling the lawn with flags, the homeowner wasn't just resisting a rule, they were exposing how absurd the rule truly was. The first shipment arrived on a grey Wednesday afternoon. Cardboard boxes filled with rolled fabric and shiny metal poles were stacked in the garage, and with each delivery, the anticipation grew. The homeowner kept their plans quiet, saying nothing to the neighbors who passed by, though a few noticed the increasing pile of boxes and raised eyebrows, but nothing could prepare them for what was coming. The first flag went up at dawn on a Saturday. The air was still cool, the streets quiet. A single pole was driven into the grass, and the first flag unfurled in the morning breeze. It wasn't the national flag. It wasn't anything political. Instead, it was something playful. A bold pirate flag, black and white, grinning skull against the sky. The homeowner stepped back, admired the sight, and felt a thrill. This was only the beginning. By mid-morning, a row of 10 flags had been planted. By noon, 20. Each one different, each one colorful, each one waving freely. The lawn began to transform into something spectacular, something no one in the community had ever seen before. Neighbors began to notice. Some slowed their cars as they drove past, craning their necks to take in the bizarre and growing collection. Others stopped on the sidewalk, snapping photos on their phones. Children laughed and pointed, running to count the flags and calling out their favorites. It was like the quiet suburban block had suddenly sprouted a carnival attraction, and people couldn't help but watch. By evening, more than 50 flags stood proudly on the lawn. The sight was overwhelming. There were stripes, stars, emblems, and symbols from every corner of imagination. The breeze carried them in unison, a kaleidoscope of color rippling across the grass. The homeowner, exhausted but exhilarated, knew that the real show was yet to come. Because tomorrow was Sunday, and Sunday was when the HOA board usually made its rounds. When morning came, the board members did exactly as expected. Their faces were a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. They stopped in front of the lawn, whispering to one another, pointing, shaking their heads. It was clear they didn't know what to do. The rules said no flags, but the homeowner had taken that rule and turned it into a statement so large, so outrageous, that it seemed untouchable. The HOA president, a stern man known for his love of rules and disdain for anything unconventional, stood glaring at the display. His arms were crossed, his jaw clenched. To him, this wasn't just a violation, it was a challenge to his authority, and he wasn't about to let it slide. But the homeowner was ready. They had receipts, documentation, and a clear understanding of the bylaws. The HOA had said no flags, but the wording of the rule was vague. Did it apply to seasonal banners? Did it apply to ornamental lawn decor? What about art installations? And what about the fundamental rights of homeowners to decorate their own property? The rule had been rushed, poorly written, and overly broad. That meant it was vulnerable. For now, though, it wasn't about arguing. It was about letting the flags speak for themselves, and speak they did. The display grew with each passing day as more shipments arrived. By the end of the week, the lawn was filled with more than 100 flags. They stood in neat rows, stretching from sidewalk to porch, transforming the house into a beacon of defiance and creativity. The neighborhood buzzed with conversation. Some loved it, praising the boldness and even donating their own flags to the display. Others grumbled, siding with the HOA and muttering about property values and community standards. But whether they loved it or hated it, everyone was talking about it. The homeowner had made their point, but the battle was just beginning. Because the HOA, embarrassed and enraged, was preparing its next move, letters would be written, threats would be made, fines would be issued. And the question was simple: would the homeowner back down, or would the flag field continue to grow until it became something bigger than anyone could have imagined? One thing was certain: this fight was no longer about a single lawn. It was about power, expression, and the line between community rules and personal freedom. And the lawn full of flags, rippling proudly in the breeze, was the opening shot in a war that was only getting started. The flag field that had begun as a bold act of defiance soon turned into something much larger. What started with a single pirate flag and a few colorful banners had by now become a spectacle that the entire neighborhood could not ignore. Each day brought more flags, and with them more curiosity, more chatter, and more attention. But with attention came escalation, and the Homeowners Association was determined not to let this challenge to their authority go unanswered. The first salvo came in the form of a formal violation notice. The letter, printed on the HOA's stiff letterhead, arrived less than a week after the first wave of flags appeared. It declared that the display was in violation of community standards, citing the newly passed ban on flags as justification. The notice outlined fines that would begin immediately, increasing each day the violation continued. It ended with a thinly veiled threat of further legal action if compliance was not achieved within 10 days. The homeowner expected this. The letter was filed carefully alongside receipts, HOA bylaws, and notes about inconsistencies in the rule itself. The HOA had assumed the threat of mounting fines would be enough to intimidate anyone into quick compliance, but what they hadn't considered was that the homeowner was not only prepared but also fueled by principle, and principle, combined with determination, is far more powerful than a threat printed in black ink on white paper. While the HOA tried to tighten the screws, the neighborhood itself was transforming. Cars began slowing down more frequently, drivers craning their necks to get a better look at the ever-expanding display. Pedestrians lingered, pointing and laughing, snapping photos on their phones. Children treated the lawn like an adventure, running between rows of flags and marveling at the sheer variety on display. Soon those photos began appearing online. A neighbor posted a picture to a local community group, captioned with a simple remark about the House of 1,000 Flags. The post exploded with comments. Some cheered the creativity, calling it the most entertaining thing to happen in their cookie-cutter community in years. Others were outraged, siding with the HOA, insisting that the display was tacky, unneighborly, and dangerous to property values. But the conversation didn't stay local for long. Within days, images of the flag-covered lawn spread beyond the community. A video posted to TikTok showcased a panoramic view of the field, set to upbeat music, with the caption, "When the HOA says no flags, so you give them all the flags." The clip went viral almost instantly, racking up millions of views, thousands of comments, and endless shares. Suddenly, the little suburban standoff was national news. Social media users debated the issue passionately. Some saw the homeowner as a folk hero, standing up to overreaching authority with creativity and humor. Others criticized the display as childish, claiming it disrupted the peace of the neighborhood. Regardless of where people stood, everyone had an opinion, and the HOA found themselves on the defensive. Local reporters soon arrived, cameras in hand, eager to capture footage of the now famous flag field. Interviews with neighbors painted a picture of division. Some spoke glowingly about the display. Others called it embarrassing. Meanwhile, the homeowner quietly watched as the story grew larger than they had ever anticipated. What had begun as a personal stand against arbitrary rules was now a viral movement, inspiring others to resist HOA overreach in their own communities. The HOA, however, was livid. Embarrassed by the sudden media attention, the board convened emergency meetings. They crafted new letters, each more aggressive than the last, warning of daily fines, potential lawsuits, and liens on the property. They distributed flyers around the neighborhood, attempting to frame the homeowner as reckless and selfish. They claimed the flag field was a danger to safety, alleging it distracted drivers and cluttered the community's image. But the harder the HOA pushed, the more they exposed themselves. Residents who had once stayed silent began questioning why the board was so obsessed with a harmless display. Wasn't the point of a community to allow some measure of individuality? Didn't homeowners pay dues for maintenance, not for micromanagement of harmless personal choices? The HOA's arguments began to look flimsy, even desperate. And then came the donations. Inspired by the viral videos, people across the country began mailing flags to the homeowner. Packages arrived daily, boxes filled with banners of every shape and size. There were sports team flags, novelty flags with jokes and memes, historical battle standards, even elaborate custom designs sent by fans. Each new delivery expanded the display further, until the lawn became less of a yard and more of a living museum of flags, each one fluttering with its own story. The field swelled past 100, then 200, then nearly 300 flags. Poles were carefully arranged in rows, forming aisles that gave the display the appearance of a miniature national park. At night, solar lights illuminated the fabric, creating a glowing sea of colors that shimmered against the darkness. What had begun as defiance had now become an attraction, drawing visitors from outside the neighborhood who wanted to see the viral flag house in person. The HOA grew increasingly frantic. Fines piled up on paper, though the homeowner refused to pay them. Threats escalated, and the board began talking about hiring lawyers. But the homeowner was ready. With the help of legal counsel, they began preparing a case of their own, one that highlighted not only the vagueness of the HOA's flag ban, but also the questionable legality of retroactively enforcing such a rule. The HOA had rushed their decision, failed to properly document it, and, most importantly, ignored the fact that homeowners have certain rights that cannot simply be stripped away by a committee vote. The homeowner didn't just prepare to defend themselves, they prepared to fight back. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was changing in subtle but significant ways. Where once residents had been passive, more and more began to voice their opinions openly. Some attended HOA meetings, demanding accountability and transparency. Others quietly began bending rules themselves, emboldened by the example set on the flag-filled lawn. Suddenly, there were driveways with chalk art, gardens with unusual decorations, and porches adorned with bright colors that would previously have drawn HOA warnings. The rigid order the board had tried to enforce was unraveling, and in its place, creativity and individuality were taking root. The HOA, for all its bluster, was losing control. But the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The board decided to escalate further, filing formal complaints with the city. They claimed the display constituted an unpermitted structure, arguing that the sheer number of poles and flags transformed the yard into something more akin to a commercial installation. They alleged zoning violations, safety hazards, and even environmental concerns. City inspectors were dispatched, and while some concerns were noted, nothing the homeowner had done was illegal. The flags, while numerous, were still considered personal property. The poles, though abundant, did not qualify as permanent structures. The city concluded that no violations existed, much to the frustration of the HOA. And yet, the pressure only seemed to energize the homeowner further. Knowing the board would not stop until they had regained control, the homeowner doubled down. They expanded the display into themed sections, rows dedicated to historical flags, rows dedicated to fantasy designs, rows celebrating sports, science, and culture. Each section was labeled, and soon visitors were treating the lawn like a miniature outdoor exhibit. The homeowner even began documenting the entire project online, posting videos that showed the growth of the display and explained the ongoing battle with the HOA. These updates only fueled the viral frenzy, drawing more attention, more support, and more outrage directed at the HOA. The comments sections filled with people sharing their own stories of HOA overreach, many of them inspired to resist in their own ways. By now, the situation had spiraled far beyond a simple dispute about lawn decor. This was a full-blown cultural clash between authority and individuality, between conformity and expression. The flag stood as symbols of defiance, creativity, and the refusal to be silenced. The HOA, once so confident in its power, was now scrambling to contain a story that had slipped completely out of its control. But the climax was still to come, because the fines, the threats, and the angry letters were leading to one inevitable outcome: a courtroom. The HOA prepared to sue, convinced they could force compliance through legal action. The homeowner, however, was equally prepared to defend themselves, armed with evidence, legal arguments, and a tidal wave of public support. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine not only the fate of the flag field, but also the balance of power between homeowners and their association. The flags waved on, proud and unyielding, as the neighborhood braced for what came next. The battle that had started with a single letter in the mailbox had grown into something no one could have predicted, and the final act was about to unfold. By the time the legal battle began, the flag field had become far more than a neighborhood stunt. It was a statement. It was a viral phenomenon. It was the kind of spectacle that transcended the boundaries of the suburban cul-de-sac where it began. The HOA, battered by public scrutiny and mocked across the internet, saw the lawsuit as their last chance to reassert control. They wanted a ruling that would prove their authority was unshakable. They believed the court would validate their rules, restore their grip over the neighborhood, and punish the homeowner for turning their community into a media circus. The homeowner, however, saw things differently. To them, this case wasn't about flags anymore. It was about freedom, individuality, and standing up to an organization that had grown drunk with power. It was about showing that one voice, backed by principle and persistence, could withstand the pressure of an entire board. The build-up. The weeks leading to the court date were tense. The HOA sent letter after letter, threatening financial ruin, liens on property, even the possibility of forced foreclosure. The homeowner, however, refused to bend. Supported by a growing network of online fans, legal experts who reached out with advice, and even neighbors who once feared the board, they were ready. The media kept the story alive. Every new development, each fine, each notice, each escalation, was reported online and debated endlessly. Commentators framed the case as symbolic, an epic clash of ordinary freedom versus bureaucratic overreach. The flag field became a pilgrimage site for people frustrated with their own HOA troubles. Cars lined the streets, visitors snapping photos and cheering as they passed by. The HOA hated every second of it. Their attempts to silence the story only amplified it further. Their flyers were mocked online, their arguments dissected, their behavior painted as authoritarian. By the time the court date arrived, the HOA was not just fighting one homeowner. They were fighting against a tidal wave of public opinion. The courtroom was packed. Local journalists filled the press benches, eager for sound bites and headlines. Neighbors crowded into every available seat, some whispering their support, others silently rooting for the HOA to regain control. At the center sat the homeowner, calm but resolute, with binders of documentation neatly stacked on the table before them. Across the aisle, the HOA's legal team looked sharp, polished, and determined to restore their client's pride. The HOA opened with a barrage of arguments. They painted the flags as a nuisance, a visual blight, a reckless display that lowered property values and threatened community harmony. They emphasized the supposed dangers, distracted drivers, tripping hazards, even environmental concerns about plastic and fabric waste. They waved copies of the bylaw amendment they had passed, insisting it was binding and enforceable. Their attorney stressed the importance of uniformity, the sanctity of rules, and the need for homeowners to abide by the standards they had agreed to when moving into the community. To them, the case was simple. A rule was broken. The violator must comply, and the court must uphold the association's authority. Then came the homeowner's turn. Their legal team dismantled the HOA's case piece by piece. First, they highlighted the timeline. The flag ban was passed only after the display began, making its retroactive enforcement unfair and legally questionable. Second, they showed that the rule itself was vague, poorly written and selectively enforced, targeting one homeowner while ignoring other minor violations throughout the community. But the most powerful moment came when they reframed the case. The lawyer argued that this wasn't about property values or neighborhood harmony. It was about the right of a homeowner to express themselves on their own property in harmless ways. They presented evidence of national recognition, viral videos, news coverage, even letters of support from people across the country. The flag field, they argued, had become a cultural landmark, a symbol of individuality, and far from harming the neighborhood, it had put it on the map. They also brought in testimony from neighbors who defended the display. Families described how their children loved walking through the flag aisles. Others said they felt pride when relatives from out of town recognized their neighborhood from online videos. Even those who weren't initially supportive admitted the display had grown on them, becoming less an eyesore and more a unique feature that gave the neighborhood character. The HOA's arguments began to crumble. Their claims of property value harm were speculative at best, unsupported by actual data. Their safety concerns were exaggerated, lacking concrete evidence. Their insistence on uniformity looked less like a noble pursuit and more like authoritarian control. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions. They scrutinized the HOA's paperwork, examined the rule, and questioned its validity. The more the case unfolded, the clearer it became that the board's overreach had crossed a line. When the judge finally delivered their decision, the courtroom was silent. The ruling was clear. The HOA's retroactive flag ban was unenforceable against the homeowner. The fines levied were null and void. The association had overstepped its authority, acting in a manner that was both arbitrary and selective. But the judge went further. They issued a stern rebuke to the HOA, warning that their behavior bordered on harassment and that their attempts to silence one homeowner had violated principles of fairness. The court ordered the HOA to cover the homeowner's legal fees, a stinging punishment that sent a wave of murmurs through the room. The homeowner had not only won, they had won decisively. News of the ruling spread quickly. Within hours, local stations reported the victory, and soon the story went national again. Headlines framed it as a David vs. Goliath moment, one homeowner standing against the might of an HOA and coming out on top. Social media exploded with celebration, with hashtags trending, memes circulating, and people across the country cheering the victory. The HOA, humiliated, retreated into silence. Board members resigned under pressure, their credibility shattered. Those who remained adopted a far more cautious tone, knowing they could not withstand another public debacle. For years to come, the story of the Flag House would serve as a warning to other associations about the dangers of overreaching authority. As for the homeowner, they embraced the moment. The flag field remained, growing and evolving with time. What had once been a stunt of defiance became a living monument to perseverance. Families continued to visit, children continued to laugh among the banners, and the display became a permanent part of the neighborhood's identity. And in the quiet moments, as the flags rustled in the wind, the homeowner knew the fight had been worth it. They had turned petty harassment into a national conversation, humiliation into triumph, and a simple patch of grass into a symbol of freedom. Months later, the story still circulated. Documentaries featured the homeowner. Lawmakers debated whether HOAs had too much power. Other residents across the country staged their own acts of defiance, inspired by the flag field. Some painted their houses bright colors, others decorated their lawns with oversized ornaments, all in the name of individuality. The homeowner never set out to be a hero. They only wanted to keep a few flags on their lawn. But when pushed, they pushed back harder, and in doing so, they revealed something important. That even in the most ordinary of places, one person can stand up, make a difference, and change the rules of the game. The flags remained, proud and defiant, not just as fabric on poles, but as symbols of resilience. Each one whispered a story, fluttering in the breeze, reminding everyone who passed by that conformity isn't always the answer, and sometimes the brightest colors shine where they're least expected. And with that, the chapter of the flag field came to a close, not as a story of loss or compliance, but as a story of triumph. A story that began with a single HOA letter and ended with a field of flags waving in victory.